Hello there. As you can probably tell from my bathrobe and fake pipe, it's time for bed. And that means bedtime stories with Sean Arthur Cox. And that means BS with S.A.C. Last time I read about 2,000 words more than I meant to. And so it went on for probably a good 10-15 minutes longer than it was supposed to. And for that, I apologize. So tonight, we're going to have a much shorter section. We're going to finish up Chapter 6. If you'll recall, William is trapped up a tree with an injured left leg in the middle of a haunted graveyard, being harassed by a pack of 4 wolves and a skeleton. He's already defeated one skeleton, and there is another. And so he has 4 wolves and a skeleton to deal with. And he is trying to lure the skeleton over to the wolves in hopes that the skeleton will take care of his wolf problem for him, or the wolves will take care of the skeleton problem. But either way, it won't be one injured kid versus 5 things trying to kill him. It'll be one injured kid versus, I don't know, fewer things trying to kill him. So let's see how well that works out for him. 15 feet from the trunk of the ancient oak, the skeleton stopped caring about bits of tree. Something else caught its attention, and while the wolves had little concern for the dietary equivalent of a shambling sapling, the skeleton's priorities had nothing to do with food. All its attentions fell on the howling interlopers disrupting the peace of its solitary post. The first wolf never saw it coming. There was a swish of air parting before the blade, followed by the squishy thunk of impact. It let out a surprised howl of shock and pain, and collapsed to the ground, a whimpering mass of once vicious meat, now food for worms and other scavengers. William's gut rumbled. And maybe road-weary adventurers? He clutched his stomach. The pangs gripped him like a vice, and tried to keep still, to keep from drawing the attentions of anything below that might wish him harm. On the ground, the wolves shifted the attack to their muted foe. The battle was a clash of opposites. The wolves, quick and ravenous, attacked en masse with military precision. The skeleton fought alone, mindlessly swinging its rusty blade at whoever moved. It didn't have the wolves' intelligence. It didn't have that predator instinct. It definitely didn't have the speed. It did, however, have raw power, which it directed into every swing of the blade, and, unlike the wolves, the skeleton felt no exhaustion, no fear, and no pain. It possessed a total disregard for its personal well-being. The battle would be brutal indeed. William watched as the two sides raged against one another. The wolves latched sharp iron jaws onto the silent sentinel's limbs to little effect. Their ivory fangs, they soon discovered, proved worthless without sensitive flesh to sink into. Worse, so long as their jaws clenched tightly around the femur and fibula in negligible efforts to rend non-existent muscle from bone, their bodies lay within easy reach of the ghastly automaton's blade, hacking and scything at the flurry of fur and fang assaulting it. The air grew rank, and with the stench of dirt and blood and death. William struggled to maintain his composure, to keep from retching up the nothing that filled his belly. His weight shifted in the branches, shaking leaves and dropping acorns. For an instant, the skeleton turned its hollow gaze to his, neglecting the jaws struggling to tear it limb from limb. William stopped moving. His eyes stopped blinking. His heart stopped beating. Even his sweat seemed to stop flowing its trickled trail down his forehead. The moon rose and set. Seasons passed. Empires crumbled. The skeleton returned its ghastly eyeless stare to the wolves, whose teeth still clamped and pulled every which way. William let out a silent sigh. Easy, he thought to himself. Just wait it out. Either the wolves rip the skeleton apart and they retreat to lick their wounds, or the skeleton hacks them up because they're too dumb to back off. Fine, you can outrun the skeleton, you just have to wait it out. So he waited, and scratched where a bug had bitten him, and waited, and cautiously poked at his ankle to see if it still hurt. It did. And waited, and marveled at how tedious a fight to determine whether he lived or to see the sunrise could be. And waited, and doubted the moon when its slow progress across the sky informed him he'd only been waiting for perhaps 5 minutes, and not the half-hour it felt like. He glanced down from time to time. The wolves had managed to tear off the creature's left arm, but the skeleton fought back with its right, and had felled another wolf, so it seemed to be a fair trade. Didn't either of these two ever give up? William cracked loose another branch, breaking it into big chunks. The combatants paused for a moment to consider the branches above them. William froze until one side or another broke the impromptu armistice, and the howling and hacking and gnashing of teeth resumed its deadly cadence. William took a hunk of wood in his hands and hurled it just beyond the fray. If it worked once, maybe he could hope for twice. The effect was subtle, almost to the point William thought his plan had failed. And then slowly, nigh imperceptibly, the fight began to move away from the tree and closer to the point of impact. Neither the wolves nor the skeleton dared to look away, but both sides, ever so cautiously of the other, shifted away from the tree, unwilling to risk a surprise attack from an unknown foe lurking just beyond the next patch of grass. For the next short while, William tossed what felt like an endless barrage of distracting sticks across the abandoned graveyard, leading the fight further from him. When he felt it was finally safe, roughly the same time he decided he'd rather die than throw one more stick, he eased himself down from the bough on his shirt and thigh-bone rope ladder. His wounded ankle took weight for the first time in at least an hour, and he winced. The swelling had gotten worse. He couldn't tell from looking at it where his leg ended and foot began. The leg would definitely need a splint when he got back to camp. Camp? That seemed so far off. How long could he run before he found the clearing? 100 yards? 1,000? A mile? He thought about how he would get himself back safely. Through the darkness with a bad leg? And firewood? Adventure was stupid. In swift movements, he lashed the femur to his leg, wrapped the tender, purpling flesh with the filthy scraps of his shirt, and propped himself up on the makeshift crutch, a 4-foot piece of bough that had broken away from its mother tree long ago, presumably of its own volition. The branch had a rounded, Y-shaped crook at the end with a smaller branch, maybe 1.5 feet down, a perfect handhold for the weak and downtrodden. William whispered an imperceptible prayer of gratitude to his local gods for his great fortune, then whispered another prayer to any gods that may have been within earshot, just in case his deity of choice couldn't exert its influence past the wall of storms and mountain that divided the realms. Better safe than sorry, he assured himself. No sense wounding the pride of a bitter divine power when he was already one leg down and 2 realms from home. William stumbled through the forgotten cemetery between crumbling tombstones and waist-high weeds. Even hunched over, his head bobbed above the grass. The crutch made keeping it below the waving concealment of undergrowth a challenge. He would have to be silent, or at least quiet enough to not attract the attentions of his would-be executioners. He hoped it wouldn't be difficult. The battle raged 50 yards away, maybe more, and the howls and growls masked the sounds of movement. He might just pull it off. His ankle caught against something. Again. More lightning bolts of agony struck his body. He bit his tongue hard and tasted blood, but no sound escaped his lips. When he reassured himself that the bloody fray across the clearing didn't care 2 copper for what one non-threatening bit of prey was up to, he unfroze, looked down, and stifled a laugh. What was the old saying about lightning striking twice? There in the dirt at his feet lay the crushed remains of a skeleton, half buried in the earth. "Got me again, you bastard," he whispered to the bones. William clenched his teeth and wrestled his foot free of the dead thing's ribs and began to shuffle away, when he noticed a glint he'd managed to overlook before. Something metal jutting from the waist. Something he must have missed the first time around, what with struggling for his life and everything. Posting the crutch to the side for support, he attempted a one-legged squat and stretched his fingers out toward the grime-encrusted object. It was cool to the touch, and hard and round, clearly contoured for a hand. He tightened his grip and pulled, feeling the weight slide free of the earth and bone. It was a scimitar. Old and rusty, perhaps, but the curve of the blade revealed what the dirt concealed. William hefted it and gave it a light swing. The craftsmanship had been exquisite once upon a time. The edge itself had been worn dull over the years, perhaps centuries, to the point of near uselessness, but the balance of the weapon persisted. He knew enough about smithing to recognize a fine weapon when he saw it, and he could mend one if need be. With a little care and a little time back at the forge, this could one day be a fine weapon again. Not that William knew anything about using fine weapons. He smiled as he tucked the sword into his belt and hoisted himself back to his feet. He had found his first treasure, and if he could just make it back to camp, he might even have the opportunity to enjoy it. Blinded by darkness, William tottered through the woods, uncertain feet groping the uneven, dew-covered ground for some semblance of reliable footing. True to Ollivander's word, his enchanted shoes were unnaturally comfortable, like wearing clouds. Still, he would gladly trade them for a pair made of thorns if they were enchanted not to slip on wet, sloping earth. Failing that, he contented himself with the knowledge that the distance between himself and the wolves grew with each unsteady step. Soon he would rest, warm and cozy next to a fire, belly full to the brim with whatever Sally had graciously placed in the twin bag. After an immeasurable period of wandering, William could no longer hear the garbled growls of wolves with uncooperative bones in their mouths, and in the distance an orange glow flickered between the leaves and branches. His chest swelled with hope, and for a few ill-conceived steps he ran toward the dim light until the stabbing pain slashed at his leg, forcing him once more to resume a more humble hobble. When the tree line parted for him, he bore a stronger resemblance to the monstrosity he'd faced than the boy who killed it. His hair matted in patches, the unpleasant result of sweat, mud, and an inordinate amount of twisting about in branches. His clothes were torn and tattered, strips flapping against his skin in the warm night breeze. The sensation rather reminded William of leaves brushing against him, albeit heavy, dirt-covered leaves. A dull ache visibly permeated his body, and his limbs hung limp from his thin torso. Ollivander, as clean as you please, looked up from his roast turkey and potatoes, steam still rising in hypnotic swirls and spirals. "There you are," he said, cool as an autumn night. "You were gone for a while, so I went ahead and made the fire. Hope you don't mind, but I started eating without you." And that's where we're going to leave it off tonight. I hope your dinner was enjoyable as Ollivander's. I hope your night was a lot better than William's. Have good dreams. Get some rest. This was Bedtime Stories with Sean Arthur Cox. Good night.